Chapter 21 of The Gray Phantom by Herman LANDON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Gray Phantom by Herman LANDON. Chapter 21. Mr. Shei's Stratagem. A swarm of jumbled thoughts and emotions crowded each fraction of a second as the Gray Phantom, standing with his back against the door, heard Slade's slow and precise voice pronounce the numerals. At each distinctly spoken word he started as if a rapier had prodded his flesh. His gaze was fixed on Helen, who from her position in the stairway stared down on the scene with eyes that appeared to see nothing, and the blank look in her face told him that she was mercifully oblivious of the meaning of it all. With the speed of lightning, stray thoughts and impressions flashed through the phantom's mind. Slade had warned him that Helen would die when he had counted 10, unless the phantom surrendered in the meantime. At Helen's back, shielded by her body against a possible bullet from the phantom's revolver, stood the executioner, ready to press the trigger. Things swam in confusion before the phantom's eyes. He would gladly have given his life if thereby he could save Helen from her predicament. But Slade dared not kill him just yet, not until he had learned where Dr. Tagala was hidden, and so he hoped to force the phantom into submission by threatening Helen. The plan was subtle and fiendishly clever, and more than once, as the seconds dragged by, the phantom had been on the point of yielding. The only thing that had restrained him was the belief that his surrender would only make the situation worse. It would deprive him of his precarious advantage, and then Helen's position would be doubly desperate. Once he glanced at the automatic in his hand, wishing that he could fire a bullet into the figure crouching behind Helen. It was a forlorn hope, for the coward knew better than to expose himself. Again Slade's voice, pronouncing each syllable with excessive precision, broke in upon his thoughts. 5, 6, 7. The phantom jerked up his head as an inspiration flashed through his mind. He still had an advantage, though his aching mind had not been able to grasp it until this very minute. Again his eyes sought the pistol drooping from his nerveless right hand. 8, 9. A note of hesitancy crept into Slade's accents, and he looked expectantly at the phantom. Evidently he was reluctant to pronounce the final word, the word that would mean Helen's death. He vastly preferred that the phantom should accept his terms, but his face showed no sign of yielding from his purpose. His lips opened, and in another moment the fatal word would have been spoken. But in that brief interval the phantom acted, and the word never left Slade's lips. Instead he uttered a long drawn-out exclamation of amazement. The phantom's maneuver had been both swift and surprising. The blue steel of his automatic had flashed for an instant in the dim light, and then he had pressed its muzzle firmly against his heart. For a few moments the crowd stared in dumbfounded amazement. Then a startled look in Slade's face showed that he understood. He bit his lip and suppressed a cry of rage. "If Miss Hardwick dies, I die too," declared the phantom in gritty accents, and the metallic gleam of his eye and the note of grim earnestness in his voice left no doubt of his sincerity. "And you can't afford to let me die, Slade. With me dead, you would never find Tagala, and then the bottom would drop out of Mr. Shei's scheme." Slade fumed and gnashed his teeth in impotent rage. A glance at the phantom's face, smiling and yet grimly determined, seemed to increase his fury. But the phantom's airy confidence was all on the surface. He knew that his dramatic gesture had only postponed the crisis, and already his mind was planning another move. At last Slade's rage cooled and his reason reasserted itself. Pointing to the stairway, he bawled an order to the man behind Helen to take her back to her room. The phantom drew a long breath of relief as she was half led, half carried up the remaining steps, but the comfort the sight gave him was of brief duration. Now Slade's finger was pointing at himself. "Take his gun away," he ordered the men lined up behind him. "Make a rush for him, all at once, but don't shoot. Go!" The men bounded forward, but in the same instant the phantom's pistol spoke twice. Two yells of pain followed the sharp cracks of the weapon, and the leaders of the rush sank to the floor. The others stopped, stared diffidently at the steadily pointed pistol, then wavered and fell back. Once more the phantom had triumphed. He cast a quick glance at the two who had fallen. He had aimed to cripple, not to kill, and he could see that their wounds were not serious. Slade shook his fist at the cowering men. "Are you all white-livered kittens?" he shouted. "Are you going to let one man bluff you? Rush at him again, all together." The phantom tensed himself for the attack. He quavered inwardly as he recalled that only 2 slugs remained in his cartridge chamber. He crouched behind the pistol, fixing each man in turn with a piercing gaze. The line advanced with a rush. Someone, more intrepid than the others, seized one of his legs and tried to pull him to the floor, but the phantom disposed of him with a vigorous kick. The next was dispatched with a well-aimed bullet, and the third went reeling to the floor from a blow with the butt of his pistol. He took careful aim before he fired his one remaining shot, and a scream of agony told that the bullet had found its mark. Again the line wavered and broke. On the floor lay 5 who had been maimed by the phantom's bullets, and one who was still unconscious from the blow with the pistol. Of the original 11 combatants, only 5 remained, but also the phantom's ammunition was spent, and at any moment one or more of the wounded might revive and get back into the fray. Slade's face was white with helpless rage. He could not know that the phantom's cartridge chamber was empty. He stamped his foot and again shook his fist at the men. Taking advantage of his temporary distraction, the phantom glided forward and, stooping quickly, snatched a pistol from the cramped fingers of one of the wounded. Then he threw down his own weapon and hurried back to his position at the door. Slade noticed his sudden move out of the tail of an eye, but not soon enough to prevent it. He turned again to the remnant of his little army. His face was dark and bore an ominous scowl. "We will get him yet," he declared, snarling. "Form a line and take aim, but don't shoot to kill. Aim for the arms and legs only. Don't shoot until I give the word." The men spread out in a half circle, and the phantom saw 5 pistols pointing at him. There was a malevolent grin on Slade's lips as he watched the preparations. Then he stepped to one side of the half circle. "Fire!" he commanded. The phantom ducked just as a chorus of shots rang out. A stinging sensation in the shoulder told him he had been hit, but he choked back the cry of pain that rose in his throat. A dense film of powder hung in the air, and for a few moments the firing line was only a row of shadowy forms. The phantom thought of flight, but someone opened a window and the smoke quickly scattered. In the next instant the blare of a motor horn was heard in the distance. The men exchanged quick glances, and the phantom fancied he saw a look of relief in Slade's face. In the muttered conversation that followed he made out the name of Mr. Shei, and new misgivings caused him to forget the stinging pain in his shoulder. Slade's handling of the situation had exposed him as a bungler, but for Mr. Shei's ingenuity and resourcefulness the phantom had a high respect. If Mr. Shei had arrived, as the blare of the horn and the conversation among the men seemed to signify, then a new and more critical situation awaited him. He glanced toward the end of the hall. A faint glimmer of dawn showed against the window back of the stairway railing. The night had been crowded with exciting events, and the time had passed more quickly than he realized. Again Mr. Shei's name was mentioned among the men, and then a hush fell over the group. A door opened at one side of the hall, and in the next instant the phantom's eyes widened into a bewildered stare. The tall man who entered, and was received with such marked deference by Slade and the others, was none other than Vincent Starr. A film floated before the phantom's eyes. It seemed almost unbelievable at first, but a succession of minor incidents and circumstances that had vaguely puzzled him at times suddenly came back to him in the light of a new significance. He had been blind, he told himself, yet it was no wonder that he had been deceived. His concern for Helen had been uppermost in his mind, and he was forced to admit that Starr had played his game very shrewdly. The newcomer cast a swift, comprehensive glance up and down the hall, then turned to Slade, and the two engaged in a low-voiced conversation. Now and then Starr mentioned Cullighore's name, and the phantom gathered from isolated words and phrases that something of an unpleasant nature had happened to the lieutenant. He learned, too, that there had been developments that necessitated quick action on Mr. Shei's part, and that the latter had made a quick motor trip from New York to Azure Crest. The phantom absorbed these bits of news with interest, but all the time he was studying the characteristic gestures with which Starr emphasized his statements. Once before, while standing in the Thelma Theater, it struck him that there was something familiar about them, and the same impression came to him now. He was searching his memory for half-forgotten facts when Starr suddenly turned round and faced him. "Surprised?" he inquired, and his smile exposed 2 rows of flashingly white teeth. "A little, at first, but I think I understand it all, now," was the phantom's nonchalant reply. Then, of a sudden, his figure stiffened. Starr had delivered another of his oddly expressive gestures, and it had started another train of recollections in the phantom's mind. "Starr," he added impulsively, "you were once a member of my organization." "Only a very humble one," admitted Starr, "and it was years back, so it's no wonder you didn't recognize me at first. In those days you scarcely noticed me, but I was watching and studying you all the time. There were a lot of melodramatic notions in my head, and the Gray Phantom was my hero. I dreamed of some day eclipsing his achievements, and I think I have succeeded. You see, the Thelma Theater, for all the fun I got out of the experiment, was only a cover for my other and more fascinating activities." "My first impression was correct, then," murmured the phantom, addressing himself rather than Starr. "I suspected Mr. Shei was a former follower of mine, and had learned his methods from me, and that's why I decided to defeat his purpose and break up his organization. Now I'm doubly glad that I took up the cudgels against you, Starr." "Glad?" A puzzled frown crossed Starr's face. "You are a beaten man, defeated by a once insignificant pupil of yours. Why should you be glad?" "Defeated?" The phantom threw back his head and smiled. Not just yet, Star. The Gray Phantom doesn't even know the meaning of the word. Before I drop out of this game, you and your crowd will be in jail." A cloud gathered on Star's forehead. "You are a curious character. I have beaten you at every turn. I have you so completely cornered that you can't even raise your pistol against me without endangering the life of a certain person whom you are deeply interested in. By the way, Slade has bungled this situation. He tells me that you have kidnapped Dr. Tagala and refuse to tell where he is hidden." "He has told you the exact facts. You will never see Tagala again until I release him. And that I won't do until Miss Hardwick has been freed and the antidote turned over to me." Star's lips curled scornfully. "As I said, Slade has bungled the situation. He doesn't seem to understand what kind of persuasion to exert on a man like you. I think I can suggest an improvement. Miss Hardwick, as I think you know, received a dose of datura poison calculated to produce death within 7 days. What is the matter?" he added quickly as the phantom winced and touched his left shoulder. "Ah, you have been wounded." "Only a scratch," said the phantom coolly, despite the sharp twinges that now and then shot through the injured shoulder. "What about Miss Hardwick?" "As I said, the injection she received was calculated to kill within 7 days. As you know, if you read the accounts of Virginia Darrow's death, the dose can be so adjusted as to produce death in a much shorter time, say 15 minutes or half an hour. Dr. Tagala, who is a very fascinating gentleman, explained the method to me very carefully." "I don't quite see—" began the phantom, an uneasy flicker in his eyes, but Star had already turned to his lieutenant. "Slade," he crisply commanded, "in one of the drawers of the desk in the laboratory you will find several bottles of datura poison. Bring me one of those marked Series A. Fetch a hypodermic syringe, too, and be quick about it." Slade withdrew. A horrifying suspicion was entering the phantom's mind. Star's methods were subtler and far more frightful than his subordinates. "You look faint," observed Star with a glance at the phantom's face. A trace of sarcasm edged his words. "I'm afraid the wound is very painful. Too bad Dr. Tagala isn't here to treat it." The phantom was about to reply, but just then Slade returned and handed his superior a syringe and a small bottle containing a dark liquid. Star studied the label for a moment. "Correct," he murmured. "It's fortunate Dr. Tagala taught me how to use a syringe. In a few moments Miss Hardwick will have received a second dose of datura poison, one that will kill her inside half an hour, unless Dr. Tagala should administer the restorative in the meantime." A cry broke from the phantom's lips. The severe pain in the shoulder, together with the terrifying realization that had just flashed through his mind, made him suddenly dizzy. He leaned weakly against the wall. In the same instant, Star, quick to seize the opportunity, wrenched the pistol from his hand. "This is ever so much better," he murmured elatedly. "I think you will be willing to produce Dr. Tagala as soon as I have injected the second dose of poison into Miss Hardwick's veins. Hold him, Slade, till I come back." He instructed one of the other men to follow him and hurried away, but his words kept dinning in the phantom's consciousness. He made a strong effort to fight down the treacherous weakness that was stealing over him. He wondered why his eyes saw nothing but whirling specks, and why his knees shook so. The loss of blood, he reflected, must have weakened him more than he had realized. Suddenly everything went black, and with a despairing moan he sank to the floor. He heard Slade's derisive laugh, but it had an unreal and far-away sound. "Dead to the world," muttered Slade, and the phantom was dimly conscious that someone was bending over him. "Well, I hope for the girl's sake that he comes to before the half-hour is up." End of chapter 21. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 22 of The Gray Phantom, by Herman LANDON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Gray Phantom, by Herman LANDON. Chapter 22. The Phantom's Ruse. The words had an electrifying effect on the phantom's nerves. Not more than a minute could have passed since Star's departure, and his imagination pictured the scene that soon would be enacted in Helen's room. He strove valiantly to shake off the numbness that had been brought on him by horror and loss of blood. Out of his half-closed eyes he saw Slade standing in a listless attitude a few feet from where he lay. Evidently he was depending on the phantom's unconsciousness to last a while longer, for he was idly toying with his pistol and seemed rather bored. Two of the other men were removing their wounded comrades, and for the moment no one was observing the phantom. A sharp realization that he must act at once quickened his thoughts and stirred his energies. His mental picture of Helen and her desperate peril stimulated his reserve forces of mental and physical vigor. Warily he glanced about him, then crawled swiftly and silently toward the point where Slade stood. Suddenly he rose to his knees and jerked the pistol from Slade's hand. In another moment he was on his feet, stifling Slade's loud cry for help by a blow with the weapon. Without a glance behind, he ran as fast as he could in the direction taken by Star. His mind was already at work on a plan. A new force, more powerful than mere bodily strength, seemed to speed him on. Despite physical weariness and the sharp twinges in his shoulder, he felt as if nothing could resist him. If only there was yet time! Reaching the top of the stairs, he turned at random in the hall. A low, drawling chuckle, uttered in a voice he recognized as Star's, drew his attention to one of the doors near the end of the corridor. He approached cautiously and looked in. What he saw assured him that he had arrived in time. He took in the scene with a single glance. A powerful man, one of those he had fought in the hall below, was seated on the edge of the cot, holding Helen's weakly resisting hand in his huge paws. In the center of the room, with a smile of gratification on his lips, stood Vincent Starr, and the phantom saw that he was transferring the contents of the bottle to the syringe. Evidently it was a slow and tedious task. The phantom waited until Starr had finished. He flexed his muscles, then lunged forward. Before either of the two men could move, the handle of his pistol crashed down on the head of the individual seated on the cot. With a queer, fragmentary squeal, he slid from his seat and lay prone on the floor. In an instant the phantom had whirled on Starr, who seemed completely taken back by the sudden interruption, and jerked the syringe and the empty bottle from his hands. Then, with all the strength he could muster, he crashed his fist into Starr's jaw and sent him spinning to the floor. Thrusting the empty bottle into his pocket and gingerly handling the syringe, he fled from the room. Despite his pain and weakness, he smiled as he sped on. Once more the gray phantom's quick mind and elastic energies were about to reverse a seemingly hopeless situation. But the danger was not yet past, and the hardest task was still to come. Starr, only partly stunned, would soon recover his wits, and then, with a hue and a cry, the pursuit would start. The thought made the phantom quicken his pace as he ran toward the entrance of the hidden chamber. A din and clamor sounded in the distance as he reached the point where a sliding panel in the wall afforded egress to the spiral stairway. Quickly closing the opening behind him, he ran down the steps. The pursuers, he knew, would never be able to locate the entrance, and for the present he was safe. He stepped inside the room and switched on the light, then placed his automatic, the syringe, and the empty bottle on the table. Dr. Tagala was lying on the bed, just as the phantom had left him. As the light went on, he gave a hoarse gasp of amazement and tried desperately to rise. "Didn't expect to see me so soon again, eh, Doctor?" The phantom removed his coat and proceeded to clean and bandage his wound as well as he could. "You tricked me very neatly, I'll admit, but the ruse didn't quite succeed. Even if it had, don't you realize that you would have been left here to starve to death?" The doctor continued to stare at the phantom, who rather enjoyed his stupefaction. He glanced at the bed from time to time, while he took several articles from a cupboard and dressed his wound. When he had finished, Tagala began to strain uneasily at the cords fettering his hands and feet. "Useless exertion, Doctor," advised the phantom. He walked to the bed and regarded the physician with a frown. Then he quickly took the syringe from the table and placed a knee on Tagala's chest. Tagala squirmed and heaved, but to no avail. With his left hand the phantom took one of the scientist's arms and pressed it firmly downward. "Steady now, Doctor. This is only a dose of your own medicine, you know. You seemed quite proud of it when you told me how you discovered it." The phantom took the syringe in his right hand, between thumb and forefinger, and pricked the doctor's flesh with the needle-like point. "I'm a rank amateur at this, but I'll try to manage. I believe the proper way is to inject the stuff into a vein, but that's a ticklish job, and I won't attempt it. This method is a little slower, but just as effective." The scientist, at last perceiving the phantom's aim, struggled frantically to free himself, but the ropes and the pressure against his chest rendered him helpless. Slowly and firmly the phantom pressed against the piston with his index finger, gradually discharging the contents of the syringe into the physician's tissue. Tagala soon ceased struggling, and the look of mute agony in his face told that he had an acute realization of his extremity. Finally the phantom tossed the empty syringe aside and removed his knee from the doctor's chest. Then he picked up the empty bottle and held it so Tagala could read the label. "Series A," gasped the doctor, and a grayish pallor overspread his hideous features. "You seem to know what it means," observed the phantom. "Starr took pains to assure me that the contents of this particular bottle would produce death in 30 minutes. Now, Doctor, don't you think you had better tell me where the antidote is hidden? Truthfully this time?" Every trace of color had fled from the scientist's face. He glared at the phantom with a mingling of dread and rage in his eyes. "Yes," he groaned at length, "I will tell you. You have me where I can do nothing else. But if I tell you, you will bring me a bottle of the antidote?" "Assuredly. I am not a murderer. It isn't for me to punish you for your crimes. I am resorting to this method only because it seems the only way to influence you to save 8 lives." "You give me your word of honor?" "My word of honor." Tagala heaved a vast sigh. "Very well, then. The other time I gave you an accurate description of the bottles, although I deliberately deceived you in regard to where they were." He spoke fast and raspingly, as if realizing that every moment was precious. "Listen carefully," he went on, and then he gave the phantom clear and detailed directions which the latter memorized. He knew that this time Tagala, actuated by mortal fear, was telling the truth. His pulses throbbed exultantly as he left the room and hurried up the steps. Shouts and scurrying feet told that Starr's men had not yet given up their search for him. The hardest and most dangerous part of the task was still ahead of him. The slightest accident or misstep might yet cheat him of the hard-earned success that now seemed so near. He groped forward cautiously, tightly clutching his pistol, infinitely alert against the slightest sign or sound of danger. The searchers were evidently in another part of the house, for he reached the laboratory without encountering anyone. He throbbed and tingled with suspense and excitement as he entered. Doubts and fears came back to him. Had Dr. Tagala lied to him, after all? Did the wily Mr. Shei have still another ruse in reserve? Was he once more walking into a trap? Would Helen and himself be able to escape from Azure Crest with the precious antidote in their possession? He was torn between maddening misgivings and serene hopes as he crossed the floor of the laboratory. Tagala had mentioned a closet in a corner of the room where, in an ingeniously concealed hiding place, he would find the bottles. His heart raced fast and hard as he stepped inside. His hands trembled, and there was an insistent throbbing at his temples as he began to follow out the scientist's directions. 10 minutes later, with pockets bulging and a great joy in his heart, he emerged from the closet. He had found 10 small bottles in all, and each one, according to the directions on the label, contained a full course of treatment. The antidote in his possession was more than sufficient to save the lives of all of Mr. Shei's victims. But he had promised to deliver 1 bottle to the doctor, and with the phantom a promise was a promise, even when made to a blackguard of Tagala's type. It would mean delay and additional risks, but he would not go back on his word. Holding the automatic in readiness for instant action, he began to make his way back to the secret chamber. He had covered about half the distance when suddenly he heard a shout at his back. It was followed by a sharp command to halt. Other voices took up the cry until the house resounded with a chorus of harsh and excited exclamations. Clear and loud, issuing commands to right and left, the voice of Vincent Starr was heard above all the others. The phantom paid no heed. He ran swiftly along, feeling that everything in life depended upon his ability to elude the pursuing throng. A pistol cracked spitefully. Then a bullet, aimed low, whistled past his knees. The phantom ran faster and faster, summoning all his remaining strength. Now he was only a few feet from the wall, but a swift backward glance told him that the nearest of his pursuers was almost at his heels. He found the deftly hidden knob that controlled the sliding door and pressed it. The wall parted, and in an instant he had passed through the opening, but someone was already tearing at his coat, and he could not close the aperture behind him. Carried on by their momentum, several men pressed and shoved against his back, pushing him precipitately down the spiral stairs. One by one his pursuers rushed through the opening at the top, shouting wildly as they slid and tumbled down the perpendicular stairway. "Get him!" shouted Starr, one of the last to pass through the opening. "Don't let him get away this time." A sense of bafflement took hold of the phantom as he saw his pursuers pouring into the little chamber, but of a sudden the glow of an inspiration came over his face. The accident that had prevented him from closing the opening had been a thing in his favor. He had left the light on upon leaving the room the other time, and now a touch of his finger plunged the chamber into darkness. He knew it would be some time before the others found the switch. Groping in the dark, he slowly made his way to the cot and thrust a bottle of the antidote into the hook of Tagala's arm. The others would have to cut his ropes later. Elbowing his way among men running wildly hither and thither in the darkness, he came to the foot of the stairs once more. Quickly he tiptoed to the top and closed the sliding panel, well knowing that Starr's men would be unable to master the mechanism that controlled it. He chuckled softly as he descended again and once more mixed with the scampering throng below. "Where is the phantom?" shouted a voice which he recognized as Starr's. "Get him, men! Get him! We may lose millions if he slips away from us. Can't someone make a light?" The phantom was crouching in a corner. "Better give Tagala a hand," he called out. "He is badly in need of help. And don't worry about your millions. They will be the least of your troubles after this." He darted across the floor before the others had recovered from their amazement. Pushing and wriggling, he reached the opposite wall. He fumbled along its surface until he found a hidden lever. At his touch, a narrow door slid noiselessly open. Beyond it was the tunnel by which he had entered the house upon his arrival. For an instant, before closing the door behind him, he paused in the opening. "Star," he called, an ecstatic throb in his tones. "The gray phantom always wins in the end." The door closed, and the phantom started toward the other end of the tunnel. Star and his men would remain prisoners in the chamber until the police could reach Azure Crest and take them into custody. With a brisk step, wholly unconscious of the pain in his shoulder, the gray phantom hurried toward the light of day and Helen. End of chapter 22. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 23 of The Gray Phantom by Herman LANDON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Gray Phantom by Herman LANDON. Chapter 23. The End of the Gray Phantom. A thin and stoop-shouldered old man, with a kindly gleam in his sunken eyes, gave the phantom a warm hand-clasp when, 3 days later, he walked into the drawing-room of the Hardwicks' residence. "How is Miss Hardwick?" was his first question. "As well as ever, sir," declared her father. "The antidote seems to have worked like a charm. I needn't tell you that I am deeply grateful to you and—" He paused and looked uncertainly at the phantom. "I wonder if you can ever forgive me for intercepting those letters. I was a meddlesome old fool." "You did what you thought best, Mr. Hardwick. Anyway, all's well that ends well. Please don't think about the matter." "Thank you for saying that. I'll call my daughter immediately." He withdrew, and the phantom sat down. His eyes were keen and bright, and there was a new vim and confidence in his manner. He had several reasons for feeling highly elated. Star and his men, trapped in the secret chamber, had been lodged in jail. The 7 capitalists were recovering rapidly following the administration of the antidote. Star, after a thorough sweating by the police, had grudgingly revealed the whereabouts of Culligore and Fairspeckle, and they had been rescued from their uncomfortable position under the Thelma Theater. Incidentally, the room had been found to contain a great amount of loot stored up by Starr's organization. The full story of the Gray Phantom's achievements had been published in the newspapers, and strong efforts were being made to have all outstanding indictments against him squashed. His adventure had been successful in every respect. He sprang up as Helen, with a wild rose flush in her rather pale cheeks, ran into the room. "Gray Phantom," she whispered. His smile was a trifle sad. "The Gray Phantom is dead," he murmured. Then his face brightened. A whimsical light came into his eyes. "But in my gardens at Sea Glimpse I am trying to bring out a little gray orchid that is to be planted on his grave, symbolizing whatever was good in him. I am thinking of calling it the Phantom Orchid." "How poetic!" she exclaimed. "But I don't quite like to think of the Gray Phantom as dead. He was so splendid in many ways, just like the hero of my poor little play. All he needed was to have the good in him brought to the surface. And that reminds me, the hero of my play was you." The phantom nodded. "I was conceited enough to suspect it as soon as I saw the reviews in the papers." Helen looked as if her thoughts were wandering away from the present. "The weirdest experience of my life was when I saw Star enact the role of the hero in my play. He actually lived the part. And it was then I first suspected he was Mr. Shei." The phantom seemed puzzled. "I am not sure I can explain. The idea that Star was Mr. Shei came to me like a flash, yet there was quite a little feminine logic behind it. My hero was modeled after you, but Star enhanced the resemblance. He introduced things that were not in my play, but which made the similarity between my hero and you all the more striking. His gestures and mannerisms were all yours. As I sat there marveling at it, the name of Mr. Shei suddenly leaped into my mind. I think Virginia Darrow must have felt the same thing. From time to time she looked at Star in the strangest way, as if she had suddenly made a startling discovery." Mumbled the phantom. "Perhaps that was why she sent Star that facetious note." "Afterward my impressions grew somewhat confused," Helen continued. "The whole thing, Star's acting and Miss Darrow's strange conduct, seemed sort of unreal. It was as if an illusion had been shattered the moment Star disappeared from the stage and the curtain went down. The officers argued that Mr. Shei could be nobody but the Gray Phantom. Their arguments made me very uneasy, and after my talk with Culligore the next day I felt I must see you. On the impulse of the moment I got on a train." She shuddered a little as if some horrifying recollection had come back to her. "It all seems like an ugly dream, and I am not sure even now that I am quite awake." For a time they sat silent, gazing dreamily into the soft sunlight. "Helen," said the phantom at length, "I feel as if a great black cloud has lifted from my life." "I feel that way, too." He found her hand and held it. For a moment his thoughts went back to the day when his fingers had first touched hers. "Helen," he murmured, "you and I have schemed together and dreamed together and shared all sorts of dangers together. I wonder if we couldn't—" Her misty bright eyes met his. A smile, warm, radiant, and tender, came to her lips. "Yes," she whispered. "Why couldn't we?" The End. End of chapter 23. End of The Gray Phantom, by Herman LANDON. Recording by Roger Melin.